Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mina. I'm a curator of the Museum of Modern Art, Kamakura and Hayama. This museum is situated in Kanagawa Prefecture, just next to the Tokyo. At first, I would like to thank you very much to Ying Lai and Junjun Lai to give me such wonderful chance to talk. I am going to talk in English, but as you look at, I prepare my PPT in Japanese, but there are many Chinese characters, so I hope that you can understand what I want to say you. Okay, this lecture contains two parts. One, the first part is about the historical background of the development of Japanese Modern Art Museum. And the next part, the last half of this lecture is about the exhibition. Now I am preparing for next spring. So I start. Is it better to use my mic? Can you hear me? Or is it better to use the microphone? It's better?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's better with my.
Okay. We say that the first public modern museum in Japan starts in 1951. It is the first museum, Kanagawa Prefectural Modern Museum. This is my museum. And yes, my museum was born in 1951. And at first, everybody knows that 1945 the World War II finished. So 1951 is just 6 years after. So it is, they don't have so many years to establish the museum. The first point of starting to establish this museum is in 1949. Artists living in Kanagawa Prefecture made an association, Kanagawa Prefectural Artists Association, to move strongly to the prefectural government to establish this museum. So the people who wanted to have this museum was the artists. They wanted to have their place to show their work. The next year, 1952, 1951's museum is Prefectural Museum. And the next year, 1952, the National Modern Art Museum in Japan was born 6 months later. And the artists and critics made the association in Japan, not in prefecture, in Japan, and moved to establish the museum. Please pay attention to the words modern and public, because yes, modern and public, and there are two museums. They are very much similar at the beginning, and they are like brothers, but they are contrasting personality at last. Here, left one is my museum, 1951, born in 1951. The Museum of Modern Art, Kamakura and Hayama. Kamakura Pavilion was born in 91 at first, and then we added the Kamakura Annex and 2003, we added the third pavilion in Hayama. At the beginning of this museum, everybody called this museum Kamakura Museum. And the next year, 1952, Tokyo National Modern Art Museum was born. So, we usually say Japanese public modern museum started their history from 1951. I would like to make a question. Is it true? I want to take care of using the word modern because the word modern has the duality. At that time, they used the word modern as contemporary. I said that the association, the Artists Association wanted to the place for themselves, for showing their works. So these works are current work. Now we use the modern for the works made in 100 years ago. But at that time, they used the word modern for contemporary. And the word public has also dual meaning. I will show you later. Two museums I introduced you, but there is another museum established in 1933. 1933, they founded the museum to see the contemporary Japanese art, but not in Japan. This museum was established in Korea. But at that time, 1933, Korea was colonized by Japan, so it was in Japan. But the art history now forgets completely this museum, this historical fact. They forget it completely. So I would like to show you the history of this museum, the meaning of this museum today. So you can see the first one is the top, 1933, and the down left, 1951, the right left, 1952. All of them are, in fact, modern museum and public. But the museum established in 1933 didn't have the word modern and public. The name of this museum is Lee Royal Family Museum. Lee Royal Family, that means there was a king of Joseon Dynasty and named Lee Royal Family, and they Japanese government added them to Japanese imperial family. So I go ahead. The starting point of the movement of the establishment, the modern art museum. Takahashi Yuichi, he is a painter, oil painter, one of the first oil painters in Japan. He wrote a plan of the ideal museum in 1881. And next, Meiji Bijutsukai. It is the first Japanese association of the oil painters. Meiji Bijutsukai made the notes to establish the museum, and they gave the opinion of
the establishment of the museum to the imperial diet, and they accepted, they approved this note, this demand of establishment of the construction of the National Museum was approved, but it was not realized. And I would like to let you know that the National Museum was established already in 1872. In 1872, the exposition was held in a big building in Tokyo, and the Ministry of Education used this building continuously for the exhibitions. So this building began to the National Museum. So 1900 years, they have already National Museum. It means that the demand of constructing the museum, what kind of museum you understand? This is modern museum, contemporary museum. I'd like to see the exhibition next, because we do not have the museum, but 1907, the Ministry of Education started having a big exhibition. This exhibition established by the government, the Ministry of Education. The juries were selected by the Ministry of Education. So it is the system of this exhibition is very bureaucratic. And the Ministry of Education bought the works of prize winner. It becomes the collection, national collection. The venue was not the museum, just building for exposition. But this building changed to the National Museum later. And it was just the hall for the exposition in Ueno Park. And the name was changed later, Exhibition Pavilion. So 1907, without proper facility to exhibit, they made the system of the exhibition and the system of the award started without modern museum, without proper facility. And at last, 1950s, 2 museums appeared. So 44 years passed. They didn't have modern museum. 44 years. I want to show you the situation of Japan at that time. The Japanese government wants to show the power of Japan at that time. Japan is well ripe as an independent cultural country because they were occupied by United States. They are looking the way to make a peace treaty. And 1951, they joined to the UNESCO, and in the same year, they got the passport by themselves, the Japanese government. And 1951, September, they got San Francisco Peace Treaty signed. And the next year, 1952, this peace treaty is going to be effected. This is the background of these two modern museums. So these two modern museums are just like a symbol of independence of Japan. What kind of exhibitions they had at that time? These exhibitions, many exhibitions were held in National Museum. I said 1887. They had already the building hall to have exposition. 1950, they had big exhibitions. The name is really strange, don't you think so? Contemporary World Art Exhibition. Such big, huge name, but they need this kind of exhibition. And 1951, they have Salon de Mai, it's French exhibition, and 51 Matisse, and 51 Picasso, 52 Black, all masterpieces. So the Japanese government want to show Japan is very cultural country, and we have the power to show this kind of big, to have this kind of big exhibition, and people, Japanese people want to see this kind of peaceful and right cultural exhibitions. But please pay attention. These are just exhibition. These are temporary exhibition, not permanent exhibition of the collections. And these are not current Japanese art. You remember that the artist association, two artist associations wanted to see the permanent exhibitions of the collections. Collection means their work, current work. Two museums opened. Who was the leader of these two museums? In case of Tokyo National Modern Art Museum, it was Imaizumi Atsuo. He was, he's not a director, he's a vice director. He graduated Tokyo Imperial University and went to Paris University and Berlin University. And the architect of his home was Sakakura Junzo. Sakakura Junzo is also the architect of Kamakura Museum. So Kamakura Museum and Sakakura Junzo has very, very deep connections. And the director of this National Modern Museum is Mr. Okabe. He was a domain head of Old District in Edo period, and he was a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was an Imperial Household Ministry head, and the head of Association of International Cultural Promotion after 1945. Mr. Okabe is the director, and Mr. Imaizumi is the vice director. I think that you can understand that vice director can move easier than the director. So the importance of the person we should see is not director, but vice director. In case of Kamakura Museum, the vice director is Mr. Hijikata. He also graduated Tokyo Imperial University. He's 2 years younger than Imaizumi. And he learned in Germany. And he worked in China from 1938 to 1945 in 2 institutions. These 2 institutions are the places to research the condition of China, because Japanese government to know how to colonize the China, how to govern the China at that time. These two institutions are researching these kind of things. And the director is Murata Ryosaku. The father of Murata Ryosaku is the chairman of Taiwan Nichi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper published in Taiwan. And Murata Ryosaku became chairman of Tokyo Art University after 1945. So I think you can imagine that Imaizumi and Hijikata, two vice directors, knew the situation of colonial Korea. So next is, I want to think about what was the example of these two museums. Imaizumi and Hijikata had an example to open their museums. That was New York MoMA. Imaizumi traveled to Europe and America from 1951 September until 1952 July, during 10 months. And Hijikata traveled many European and American museums too. So they knew about European museums and American museums. And they chose New York MoMA as an example for their new museums. They learned many things and they decided the bound of the works of their collection, the constitution of the staff, and the concept of exhibitions, etc., from the New York MoMA. What is the reason why they chose the MoMA, not European museums, but MoMA? To imagine the reason, I try to think about another museum established in 1933 in colonized Korea. That museum was modern museum and public museum, in fact, but this museum doesn't have the name modern and public. I would like to see the Lee Royal Museum a little bit. Exhibition of Japanese art in colonized Korea. 1933, the name of the exhibition is Exhibition of Japanese Art in Tokusu Palace of Royal Lee Family. Who is the agent of this museum? It looks Royal Family, Royal Lee Family, but in fact that was Japanese colonial government. And who and how select the works to show in this museum? It was Japanese government too. And purpose was, they said the purpose of this museum is education. Educate Korean people, but in fact, it was the demonstration of Japanese occupation policy. The place is the Royal House. The background of the establishment of this Lee Royal Museum. 1919, March 1st, there is a very big independence movement. Korean people walked on the street just saying Banzai. Banzai walking. Just Banzai walking. But Japanese army used a big violence to them. And the colonial government learned that violence cannot stop them completely, and they changed the policy, colonial policy. And they decided to use cultural control for the government, for the governance. They forced to use Japanese language, so Korean people lost their own language, and forced to use the Japanese name, and school they teach in Japanese. There are many modern systems in Korea, school, exhibition, and education. They are all Japanese system, not Korean system. So Korean people were blocked completely in the Japanese system. It was the actuality of colonial Korea at that time. And for this cultural governance, colonial government tried to decide to make the exhibition, not museum. In Japan too, they decided to have the exhibition first, 1907. In Korea too, they decided to make an exhibition first. 1922, Choson Art Exhibition was established. This exhibition was established by the colonial government, and central person is all Japanese. Jury was sent from Japan, almost from Tokyo Art College. And this exhibition is subscription free. Anybody can apply. It means that this exhibition is not professional art exhibition. Not professional, not only professional, but also the amateurs can submit. And this exhibition became the first step to become a professional artist. So in Korea, this exhibition had certain importance, of course. And this exhibition begins without the proper museum. And then, 1933, the Royal Family Museum opened. They used the palace. They used the purpose of the palace to the museum. There are 4 palaces in Seoul, and Toksu Palace is one of the 4 palaces. And this museum is not for the Choson Art Exhibition. This museum is not for the exhibition. This museum is for show the collection. Show the Japanese current masterpieces. In the catalog, they said, we would like to show the most wonderful works of masters of nowadays to Korean people, because it is rare. There is rare chance in Korea to see this kind of most wonderful art. So Japan kindly provide the chance to see, they wrote. And they said, we educate the professional artists in Korea, they wrote. This is the catalog of the exhibition in Tokusu Palace. It's really beautiful catalog, color-type print, and it is very expensive. I think this price is not for sale, but for give as a present to the foreigners or diplomats like that, to promote the success of Japanese colonial policy. This is Tokusu Palace, stone palace. In Tokusu Palace, there is a stone palace. Left side is a page in the catalog. This stone palace, the architect of this palace was English architect Harding. In 1900, they started the construction. In 1910, they completed the construction. In 1911, the prince of Lee royal family came back to Korea from Japan and entered this palace. The right side, you can see the situation now. This palace remained now. Light, upside light, right. At left, you can see the prince. He is prince. Left side, this photograph was took in 1911, and the right side you can see the renovated situation in 2007. And next one, Japanese colonial government decided to construct one other museum just next to this stone palace in 1938. This is the original stone palace, and this one is new pavilion. It is connected by the bridge here, so you can see the two palaces at the same time. And in this palace was used, was the very big stage to protest to Japan from 1898 to 1910, just before their colonization in this palace. So they changed this palace to the museum. It means that Japan won completely to Korea, because it is palace. It was palace, but now the prince cannot live anymore in this palace. They lost, Korean royal family lost completely the house to live, it means. And the next building, this is also stone palace. It's new. Colonial government closed the Korean Traditional Museum in another place. They made this museum closed, and they moved all of the contents, Korean traditional arts, to this new building. So, what's happened? We can compare with two things. Old Korea, traditional arts, but we cannot have anything to see now. We do not have anything to see important things now in Korea. But here, there are many masterpieces of Japan, bringing from Japan. So, Japan is a great country now, so kindly try to educate Korea. We can see this double-minded situation here as a museum. We can hear museum, then we can hear the museum. Well, it's a very good thing, but background of these two museums is the colonial policy. What kind of art exhibited in the Stone Palace? You would like to see? This is Embu, Flame and Butterfly by Hayami Doshu. He is one of greatest artists in Japanese painting. And the next one, Okada Saburosuke. He's a professor of Tokyo Art University, and he is one of the jury of Choson Art Exhibition. Oil painter. And this is the work of Kuroda Seiki. He was one of the biggest oil painters, and he became a diplomat. And exhibition room, you saw the inside of the palace just before, and this is the renovated situation to the museum sculptures. This one was the original situation, but like this, they renovated the palace to the exhibition room. Okay. And who are the central person of this Royal Lee Family Exhibition construction? 黒板克美、杉江三郎、和田栄作、正木直彦、工藤宗。They are Kuroita is a professor of Tokyo Imperial University, and Sugi is the director of Imperial Museum. Wada Eisaku is a painter, and he is a chief director of Tokyo Art University. And Masaki Naohiko was the director of the Tokyo Art University, and now at that time he is the director of the Imperial Art Academy. And Kudo Sohei is working in the imperial household. This person, just 5 persons, moving very strongly to make this museum. You see, Japanese people, artists, moved over 40 years, but they couldn't realize their own museum in Japan. But these 5 persons could realize the museum in Korea. It is the real situation in colonized Korea. They are researcher and artists. They are in the art world, but they worked for the nation, not only for the artist, not only for the art, but for the nation. And they are all in the bureaucratic system. interesting to see the diary of Masaki Naohiko. We can see an example of a kind of camouflage of colonial policy in his diary. January 16, they wrote that the management house of the Lee royal family asked Masaki to choose the Japanese art to exhibit, he wrote. And September 13th, Prince Lee, who came to Tokyo Art University, and he saw privately the Japanese artwork exhibited in stone pots. So from January to September, just 8 months, it's enough to construct the museum. It's very short. And we can see how they camouflage this establishment of the museum. They make a front face. The family asked to make a wonderful museum for Japanese art for Korean people. They make a front face like this. But on the newspaper, the newspapers wrote that Toksu Palace, Korean people, naturally, Toksu Palace is their own palace, Korean palace. So they wrote that the new museum is becoming for Korean people and for exhibiting Korean current artwork. But a few days before the opening, the newspapers found that this museum is not for Korean art. It is for Japanese art. So they camouflage, they cover up the true intention using the name of Lee royal family. The purpose of this museum, is to educate the art of Korea, include Korean people. But in fact, it is a part of promotion and advertisement that Japanese governance of colonial Korea is going very well. They use as a symbol of Japanese cultural policy of colonial, they use this museum as a symbol of Japanese cultural policy of colonial governance. That is the fact. Mission of this Royal Lee Museum. It is a permanent exhibition of Japanese current art. This is not for the museum for exhibition, temporary exhibition. It's a permanent exhibition they did. And this history, when we know this history, we can understand that the two modern museums, born in 1951 and born in 1952, were not established on the tabula rasa. They had this big experience. We can conclude that the Royal Lee Museum is the first example as a modern public art museum. Permanent exhibition of current Japanese art they can see. And this museum became a test case for the modern museums established in 1950s. But this fact is forgotten in Japanese modern art history. What is the differences of this Lee Royal Family Museum from the modern museums, two modern museums born in 1950s? Lee Royal Museum constructed completely under national policy, and government bureaucrats lead the plan, all of the plan to construct. And the artist selection is based on the ministry exhibition to exhibit in this museum. And this museum is a symbol of the nation rather than doing research the art history. This is the biggest different point from two modern art museum and Lee Royal Family Museum. Please remember two leaders, Imaizumi and Hijikata. Imaizumi he was born in 1902, so he was 43 years old in 1945, and he was 31 years old when Lee Royal Family Museum was established. And Imaizumi is art critic. He associated the Association of Art Critics in Japan in 1936. That means he was in the movement to establish a modern museum in Japan before 1945. And the director, Okabe, was the Minister of Education before 1945. Minister of Education is the chief department of doing big exhibitions in Japan and in Korea. So everybody can think that Imaizumi and Okabe knew very well about the situation in Korea. Hijikata is also worked as a researcher, worked for the nation, Japan. And when he was in China, he experienced the gunfight between Japanese and Chinese when he ran away from China in 1945. His Japanese friends, many friends, were killed in this gunfight. And Murata Ryosaku, the director, his father was the chief executive of Taiwan daily newspaper in colonized Taiwan. So many informations could come to him. So, did Imaizumi and Hijikata know nothing about Lee Royal Family Museum? It is hard to think. I don't think that Imaizumi and Hijikata didn't know anything about this history. That's why they create the new position, curator, named curator.